Freedom. Oh, freedom. Those fireworks a few days ago were pretty far out, if I do say so myself. It's Solomon again, all laid back in my temple. If you didn't catch my earlier broadcasts, I can't tell so far if anyone is actually listening. Might help if I was hijacking a major channel, but for now, I'd rather just lay low. I'm not really in the mood to get threatened. Just, well, yet anyway. Still, someone seems to know that I'm live and on the air. Once again, I've received an anonymous letter, and once again, I was sound asleep. I really ought to just take time out of the day to pretend that I'm sleeping. Although maybe that will just end up with our mysterious postman leaving these while I'm not here. I'm not really sure what to say about this one. It's possibly another piece of the puzzle, or possibly not. Quite frankly, anyone could just pen these up and ship them off to my doorstep, but I'm not so sure in this case. This one makes mention of a recent element, one that I didn't mention in any of my other broadcasts, and one that wouldn't sit too kindly for the people in charge if it is in fact true. But I'll let you be the judge of that. Me? Well, I made up my mind a long time ago. Regardless of all of my monologuing, I'll say it once again for all of you groovy listeners. Curl up nice and cozy. Lock your doors, keep a shotgun handy, and open your earwaves for tonight's riveting story. It's sure to be a discovery.
The Eastmouth podcast is written, directed, and narrated by DC Tullis. Based on the world created by DC and JD Tullis.
Ah, yes. Welcome back to the most desolate radio show on Earth. We're a town of less than 1,500 people and can't say no to a fresh lobster and a side of fries. Maybe a cold lager, too. God, now I'm getting hungry at the thought. But even in a town such as this, we've got quite a few mysteries on the prowl. I go through the paper and far more history books than I realistically should. But it seems that these letters here are my most intriguing source. So, dear listeners, here goes the one that I received just this afternoon. Feel free to make up your own opinions and write to me with your responses. If you can find me, that is. I heard your last broadcast and thought this might be of interest. Don't come looking for me. Ah, well, at least someone respects privacy around here. C invited me over to the woods by the old Deering stables for kicks and to maybe hunt a little. They really ought to fix those stables up. I haven't seen anyone visit them to ride, and those horses might as well be dead at this point. We'd met at the closest perimeter of the woods at 7 o'clock, a good hour and a half before sundown. There were clouds overhead blocking out most of the sun, but it wasn't rainy. Our goal had been to sneak off into them and see if we could nab a deer. If not, we'd head back and grab a malt. Well, that had been our plan, anyway. It was not, as this letter should already signify, what we experienced on our little getaway. We'd each brought our own gear. Bolt cutters and water canteens carried on C, flashlights and snacks for me. Had we known what would happen, we would have packed smarter. The wind had been blowing coolly as we navigated along the perimeter of the fence on our bikes for a couple of minutes. We noticed a beat-up section of the fence shrouded by trees. Hopping off, we hid our bikes under a few bushes and C brought out the bolt cutters. He snaked them along a section of the fence and cut a 2-foot line. It was just large enough for us to push aside and sneak through. With a grin, we'd hopped into the woodlands beyond the fence and he'd readied his rifle, ready to find a buck laying in the wait. For me personally, I'd never been hunting before. I'd grown up caring for animals rather than killing, but the way C talked made me, strangely enough, almost excited. He seemed to have a love for the subject and the animals themselves. Didn't really make sense to me, but I knew that he would have a good shot and use them well after the fact. 25 minutes in, flashlights out, we could already detect the darkening of the sun around us. The branches reached out to touch us, lingering on our shoulders, thorny plants tugging at our jeans. I haven't seen a single animal yet, I'd told him. Relax, V. We'll bag a gnarly deer or at least something small like a rabbit. I'm starting to doubt that. I'd laughed as we descended down a slight hill and into a muddy clearing. We'll find one. Gotta keep one eye open and be real quiet. That's what my uncle says kept them alive in the war. Oh man, he used to tell me all these stories. Best damn tracker in the state. See, he had said something like that. He started rambling quite a bit about his uncle, and at a certain point I'd tuned most of it out. I mean, if he said he saw something out there, we'll find one. My uncle never lies. Was he by chance drunk when he told you all of this? Well, his flask was out, yes, but I knew it! Remember when your uncle told you that you could catch more fish with a tennis racket and wood glue? Well, I caught a fish. You didn't even catch any. I'm just gonna cut in here. This really shouldn't need to be said, but don't listen to your drunkard of an uncle when he tells you to break into private property and start shooting. He may know how to catch a buck, but he's probably in his second marriage. Shh. C had hushed, pushing me down onto the leaves. He crouched down too, aiming the scope of his rifle through the tree line. There was silence as he steadied his barrel and took a few deep but quiet breaths. In, out. In, out. The silence was almost touchable. And then the shot rang out, and I'd wished that I'd covered my ears. After a moment's daze, I looked back to him. You get it? I'd asked. He almost seemed shocked, his lip quivering for nearly 5 seconds before he replied. It was a whitetail. Unlucky bastard, he said, sounding nearly melancholic. He paused for a moment before standing up and lowering a hand. It doesn't even feel real. We just arrived and shot it. No tracking, no waiting, no story to it, and I don't know what to say. Just say your mother can cook it without burning it, because mine sure can't. He chuckled at that and nodded. Quite a catch, and I'm telling you that fresh deer are a hell of a lot better than anything you can get at the A&C. I nodded and was back on my feet. Excitement. That was what I had felt. I really hadn't expected any more of it coming from the rest of the night, but the thought of a fresh meal that wasn't cooked by my own mother was certainly exciting. And then there was a gust of wind that brushed past us. An icy chill blowing in from the sea, almost as if it had been waiting for something to happen. Sometimes I really think about moving to warmer climates. Maybe I should. You're welcome to give me suggestions. We've all thought of moving. If I was sponsored, I could throw a line about Texas being the summer comfort state or something. But I'm not. I hate the heat, and I doubt you could get a fresh lobster to save your life. Anyway, the deer was really heavy. Far heavier than I expected it to be. Frankly, I almost wished he shot something smaller, but we soldiered on. I was excited for whatever C's mother would cook. He was talking about his uncle giving him a rifle for his birthday. He was really hooked on the idea, on, detailing in depth all of the training he'd received. We'd made it a good 5 minutes of dragging, trying to put our minds off of the wait with anything that we could. Over fallen logs, around little ponds, slowly dragging the body, hoping that it didn't get damaged along the way. As I'd started to drift from the conversation, C dropped to his knees and began a prone crawl all the way to a bush maybe 15 feet in front of us. A straight path up a leaf-strewn incline. He turned around for a second to put a finger to his lips before he continued up it, and as I hadn't noticed at the time what had brought his sudden sense of caution, I followed right up after him, carefully mimicking his movements. Each step forward scraped my sleeves against a thorny bit of foliage, but I continued on and gradually began to detect what he'd noticed. Voices, drifting through the air. 2 men, it sounded like. They must have been a solid 50 feet from us. One had begun to speak in a slightly raised tone. I crept next to C and burrowed myself in the bush. There was no way to see us, and likewise we couldn't see them well either. But they easily could have heard the gunshot. Angry townsfolk meant running or hiding. It also meant no dinner. It was raspy, one of their voices, like sand coursing through a cheese grater.
It's wrong what they did. There had to have been alternatives. Something more ethical.
I don't remember seeing many. He was the last blockade, replied the younger voice. I could smell just the faintest hint of his cigarette from where we hid.
You act like he was an object.
Might as well have been, just like the orchard.
Those are on completely different levels,
replied the raspy voice. Are they? It's prime land, and its owner didn't seem to mind the offer.
It was more than prime. It was worth conserving. And now it will be just another church.
Hey, that's just the way they all voted. Come on, why is your head always up in the business of it all? We've just gotten out of a discussion, and you can't think of anything more interesting. What about the game? Black Bears got hammered pretty hard. The shorter one had turned around and lowered his voice. I couldn't quite make out what he said till the younger one started laughing. Age hasn't given you much wisdom, Douglas. There's deeper things at play than you will ever know. Sid tightened his grip on his rifle and glanced back towards the deer.
Maybe we ought to move. Sounds like they'll be here a while,
he'd whispered. I dismissed the motion with a nod and kept on listening. It's just a church.
Ah, just a church. Just like those doors are just doors,
called the raspy voice as he turned back around and moved a few feet closer to us. He was eyeing our direction, but I don't think he ever saw us. They are.
Not likely. Locked doors in the sewer, all marked by the symbol. The blueprints don't have them listed at all. How could that be? Age-old town prints like that? That's where our attention should go.
Dougie, now you're sounding a little crazy.
Don't Douglas me this and that as you muck up the air and smile at me like I'm some kind of fucking insect.
It's for the betterment of the town, Douglas. Oh, come on. Don't look at me like that. That's how Johnson looked too, right as he became an obstacle. I'd turned to see, stunned. He looked back at me with wide eyes, appearing as if to have reached the same conclusion. They can't be talking about that, Johnson, I'd whispered to C. He didn't respond. I don't think I need to explain the situation. Maybe our anonymous writer doesn't, but for any uninitiated, Charles Johnson was co-editor of the Eastmouth Tribune until a month or so ago. And then he disappeared. No signs of break-in, car still in the driveway, real mystery. The town has had its, well, fair share of gossip, but he wasn't the sort of person to be missed. So after a brief manhunt, it was assumed that he merely killed himself. Regardless, dear fishermen of Eastmouth, if a corpse missing a few teeth washes up in your catch, don't fashion the naked body as a figurehead. That would be cruel, and it would smell. Go to the authorities. You've been advised.
I should have moved out a decade ago.
Douglas grumbled before storming off. The remaining person tarried around for a few minutes, finishing the remains of his cigarette before kicking it into the dirt at his feet and moving off in the direction that the other headed. A minute after he left, I nudged C and we picked up the carcass of the deer, its slowly decomposing body, a thought that had lingered little in our minds. "We're not going to talk about this," he said. "Don't see much reason to go prodding landmines." "Are you kidding? They just admitted knowledge of a potential murder," I'd replied. Again, no response. Instead, he'd just begun to lug the deer up the incline by one of its legs. I followed him, and then soon we were at the top. Sweat trickled down lightly as we kept moving, inching ever nearer to where the two men had spoken. It was growing darker at a rapid rate, too, to the point that it was almost nearly black around us. And the deer seemed to only be growing heavier. Neither of us wanted to be stuck in the woods during sundown. But, according to C's uncle, just before sunset was prime hunting hours in these woods. Remembering that ever-harshening breeze, though, I had to disagree. Thinking about it now as well, I hadn't ever actually met his, well, eccentric uncle. Although I'd certainly heard many stories. I'd thought that I might have a chance later that evening as we reached where the two men had been standing. I was about to suggest that we rest for a minute, till the forest floor suddenly gave out beneath me. It was a sudden stumble accompanied by the cooling of concrete as I slid down a series of stairs hidden beneath a faux leaf netting and landed face first into a small pile of unswept leaves. "You okay down there?" C called from above. The decline must have been nearly 8 feet. "My head feels like it was screwed on backwards, but the rest of me feels all right," I'd replied. "Hey, come check this out." C carefully scaled the eroding steps and helped me back to my feet. "What is this place?" It was a bunker of some sort, a thick slab of filthy concrete sticking out of the earth. Its only distinguishing feature, the rust-covered door in its front. It was like someone had stolen the vault door to a highly secured bank, cut it in half, and assembled it back together. "It's a bunker of some sort. It's gotta be related to those two guys. Maybe it's protection against the Ruskies." "Possibly," he said. "But why would it be all the way out here, and why would it be locked? What if it's filled with bodies? Despite what we heard, fingers crossed it's not that." Solomon here. Maybe if I could throw a guess, it would be for keeping anyone snooping around out. People, you know, like you, V, if that's even really your first initial. Just a little thought. He gently grabbed the chain that locked the opening hatch firmly in place. "This isn't going anywhere." Looking up at the sky, he turned back to me, and then lowered his gaze. "Come on, we should book it and get the deer home. We've already spent a lot of time out here. Tomorrow we can come back and check this place out." "You're a scaredy little chicken," I'd teased him. I teased him as I dug the bolt cutters out of his bag.
Oh, come on, what are you...
And then came the snap of the chain. Sia eyed me over with exasperation, his face locked in disbelief.
You always loop me into this stuff. Scared of a little adventure? Now come on and help me with this... this... hatch. Whew. Come on.
And then we were through, drowned in the absolute darkness of the space. The bunker was about the right size to comfortably let 3 people live. 2 cots and a hammock clung to the leftmost wall, while the center was occupied by a table. A blackboard sat in the back, surrounded by 2 bookshelves. What kind of bunker is this? It sounds like a teacher's retreat.
Who do you think uses this? Hunters or survivalists?
Sia had asked me.
Maybe it's a serial killer. You don't need to put any ideas in my head. At least I've got my Model 70.
Ah, yes. Thank God for Mr. Army Man.
I don't think these woods are hiding any killer deer.
He shook his head and began to root around through a bookshelf while I examined the blackboard. Chalked lines scaled the surface, marking it with mostly inane plans. Summer bake sale, yearly blood drive, election budget, phone lines, Oak Creek Lutheran Church.
Find anything interesting yet?
Sia asked.
Nothing related to Johnson or whatever they were talking about with the sewers. What about... Jeez!
I'd nearly shouted as he shoved a book in my face.
What is that?
What's the cover say? It had read a beginner's guide to the ruins of the old world. So, as I'm writing this letter, I think we can determine 3 things about the occupants of the bunker. They might be involved with the town council. They might be involved with a disappearance. And they are, with absolute certainty, completely nutters. So who knows where that leaves us?
Who'd have a book like this?
I'd asked C.
Maybe they're hippies,
he'd replied.
Those guys? Doubt it. Well, whoever they are, they're certainly a little odd.
The creepy hidden bunker didn't give that one away. He furrowed his eyebrows at me, and I turned around to thumb through the papers on the table. Surveys, test flyers, bills, a few complaints from citizens, and then a paper cut. Quick little slice as I frisked through the documents. It wasn't like the other sheets. Whatever it was had been printed on a heavy paper with sharp edges. I lifted off the documents above it and quickly motioned to see.
Now this is a find, he said. It's a map of the sewers. Well, they were talking about it. I wonder why they care so much. That can't be right, can it?
I followed his finger, cradling my own index finger at the same time.
But why? That's St. Gabriel's, right? I think so.
If the map was right, the sewer system connected directly to a door in the basement beneath the church.
Camera,
I insisted as I dug through his bag and pulled it out. It would take a while to develop, but I didn't want to lose something like this. Blueprints to the sewer systems aren't publicly available information. However, those 2 acquired it was a question. Why they cared about the doors, which they'd marked with black circles, was another. But it had been the connection to the church that really stood out to me. The camera light flashed and C ducked as the light overwhelmed the bunker and blinded us both. After a minute of silence, C exhaled and looked around.
We didn't find anything about Johnson, and with those recently used beds over there, those 2 could come back any minute.
You're right.
I'm glad we stayed, though. I said as I put the camera back in his bag. But you're right, we really should get out of here. What if we call the county sheriff or talk to someone on the council? They probably wouldn't want this confidential city plan out here in some kind of crazy bunker. What if they're a part of this? Maybe, he said as he stopped to consider. I don't know. I'm just starting to get really creeped out. That deer is just wasting away too, not to mention it's already getting colder. Shouldn't we talk about this over dinner?
Under the veil of excitement, I had hardly noticed the growing beast of hunger that was my stomach.
They'll probably change the lock, but there doesn't seem to be anything else here but a plain old bunker. Let's bug out of here.
Carefully, the door was shut behind us, and we scanned the ground above the stairs before emerging. As we had stepped out into the still night, I'd had, and I still have, the sinking feeling that we'd missed something. We were in the clean then, or at least I'd thought that then. Gradually, as we reset the netting, picked up the deer, and began moving towards where we thought our entrance point was, that sinking feeling began to spread into something else entirely. It wasn't fear, no, Mr. Solomon. It had been like a fluttering anxiety. My hunger began to sliver back up inside of me, and nausea started to take its place. I'd taken a look up at the sky after a few minutes and realized just how dark it was. The moon was completely overshadowed by clouds, and as we neared the 10-minute mark, I realized something worse. We were lost. The branches around us seemed to twist and stretch towards us, the trees resembling gnarled giants. It became harder and harder to drag the deer as its body snagged onto roots and rocks and slowed us as we scaled the small inclines of the forest. Eventually, I couldn't take it. "We're lost," I had said as I took a moment to sit down on a fallen log. "I hate to say it, but I think you're right, V." He had groaned and ran his hands through his dark hair as he looked back to me. Wait, please don't tell me. I swear to God, if this letter turns out to just be long-form written erotica, I'm gonna burn this damn place down.
So, any idea how to not be stranded out here in the middle of the wilderness? I mean, if we go the wrong way, we'll end up miles outside of town. Can't use the moon. No shit, I replied. C sat next to me for a moment before he licked his left index finger and stuck it up into the night air. We can follow the wind. How can you even... you can do that? Yeah, but you didn't just bring a compass. Yeah, not one of my better ideas. I'd sighed, exhausted but relieved. He stood there for a moment, waiting for a strong gust of wind to tickle his finger. It's going east. I think we might have been headed southeast before, when we really should have been following it. I'd thought for a moment, but couldn't come up with a wisecrack. I just meekly nodded, too exhausted to care beyond the thought of abandoning the deer carcass. Even with all the exercise, I had already begun to lose my hunger. After we'd taken a couple of drinks from his canteen, we'd set out again, this time in the right direction. A few minutes later, and we were both relieved to see the forest widening up again. Less snags on the deer, less branches to scrape at my flannel. And then there was silence, a forced, sudden silence as I shot my arm out and blocked C's movement. There had been no noise from it, but my eyes, now well attuned to the night, had picked out the sight. A shadow, vaguely humanesque, as it seemed to tear apart at something small on the forest floor. An animal carcass or a small child. Neither of us could tell what it was eating, but it could tell that we were watching. A blink. Just a simple blink, and then it was gone. I stayed in silence for a few seconds before I nudged C to make sure that I was awake. There was more than just a mysterious bunker in these woods. There was something feeding. I began to ask him a question in a low whisper, but C responded with his hand over my mouth and by taking the rifle off of his shoulder. Slowly he crept towards the carcass. I'd followed in tow. Now, I'm still not sure what we'd seen that night, but I have to say that I have no intention of re-entering that portion of the forest ever again. Laying on the ground only a few feet in front of us was the corpse of a fox. Its torso had been removed entirely with almost surgical precision, and its neck had been snapped into the entirely wrong direction. Its lifeless eyes gazed up at us, not in fear, but rather in absolute surprise. It hadn't sensed its own demise. "Screw this," I'd said. "I'm tired of lugging that damn deer around. We're 10 minutes from town, and with all that's happened, we should go, now." C didn't reply. His eyes were overtaken with a sense of vigilance, the eyes of a hunter. He scanned the branches, presumably for the shadow that we had seen. He didn't see it, but I did. Nearly 30 feet from our position, buried under a cloak of shrubbery, stared a set of 3 bloodshot yellow eyes. No irises, no blinking, staring directly at us. Patiently, they studied us, devoid of emotion, unsure whether to cut us up like the fox. Stifling a whimper, I nudged C and began to point. I couldn't hold still. I couldn't keep my fingers still. I couldn't keep anything still. There was no such thing as 3-eyed bears, nor wolves, nor humans. I blinked again, and then it was 10 feet closer, once again submerged by the brush. It was then that my mind had gone blank. I hadn't signaled to C, and he hadn't signaled to me, but we both began to sprint in the direction of what we desperately hoped was Eastmouth. My breathing had turned rapid. The weight of my legs was gone, and I'd forgotten entirely about the bunker. All I could do was force myself to not look back. We ran, stumbling, thrashing against anything that came into contact with us, focusing on the lighthouse that we'd seen peeking over the tree line. Running so fast we hardly even noticed the decline, till we each got a mouthful of grass and slammed into the silver fence at the foot of the forest. My head had been spinning like a top, yet we somehow managed to scale the fence and collapse onto the cracked pavement below. C had turned to look at me, and I to him, but neither of us said a word. We couldn't say a word. We could hardly breathe. Well, I'm going to have to put at least part of this letter at a higher level of suspect than the first. You see, Johnson did disappear, as you all should know, and sometime between the writing of this letter and its arrival, he was found hanging from a tree at the end of Willow Way. You know, the famous street known for housing the ghost house? The one with the spooky lights? Load of horseshit, I'd say, but he was found dead there. Some of his friends at St. Gabriel claimed he had been depressive for the last few months before his disappearance, so really, who knows? The yellow eyes, though, I can't be the only one who's doubtful of that. But hey, if anyone wants to clear out those woods past Main Street, you're welcome to write me and tell me if you find any animal carcasses and secret bunkers. Better be careful, though, or you'll catch the council's ire. On a more serious note, do be careful out there. It's private property, so you never know what you might find. And for returning guests still intrigued about the first letter, I'm ashamed to say that I've made no progress on cracking the code. Or at least, real progress, that is. That symbol, the eye within the 2 crescent moons, really does seem familiar. Maybe I'll stumble on the answer when I'm just
mindlessly dozing off. Beyond that thought, though, I'm duped. Not really the slightest clue about a theory. If anyone knows something, feel free to write to me about Eastmouth-specific coded languages and send it to the address that somehow 2 people have found. If you can do that, I will consider reading your letter on air. Beyond that, I haven't got much else but that titillating story. So, just remember, dear listeners, or lack thereof, tell the town council to kiss off. Drive out to the Eastport record store and pick up some jams, and lock your doors at night. There's plenty of rumors surfacing in the area, and if even a tenth are true, I'd be wary. So, have a good night, and don't let the sea monsters bite.